Hello everyone, welcome to my Substance Painter workshop. Thank you for joining me. So let's get started. So in order to even start in Substance Painter, we need an object. So let's go over the workflow of getting our object from Maya into Substance. So if we open up Maya, I did drop in a object called Oil Barrel, courtesy of Professor Heinz Schuler for using this in his 3D lighting and texturing class, as well as our environment modeling class. So this object has very basic UVs on it. We can just pull that up and you can take a look. So I didn't want to bring up anything too complicated, as it just makes it easier to paint. So something really important about getting an object into Substance is making sure that we clean this up properly and that everything looks good so that we don't mess up our UVs and things like that. So before we get started, we want to add a material to this. So the importance of this is in Substance Painter, we have these things called texture sets. So essentially a texture set is something that when you assign a material to an object, that material is going to go into Substance Painter as one material that we can use to paint on top of. Something to keep in mind is if we're using opacity of any kind, it's important to set a different material in Maya itself so that Substance Painter knows that this specific material is used for opacity. But for this oil barrel, we don't really need opacity, so let's just start by assigning a material to this. So if we right click and assign new material, we can just throw on a Lambert, or you can throw on an Arnold shader, doesn't really matter, as long as we have a material. So let's just go into Maya and then throw on a Lambert material. Usually it's good practice to name your materials so you know exactly what you're working with when you go into Substance Painter. So let's just name this Oil Barrel. Just something simple. And okay, so now that we've identified our material, we're going to export this object as an FBX to take this into Substance Painter. So there's a few steps we need to do before we get it in. So real quick, since we've assigned a material, we have a little bit of history on this object. So let's edit, delete by type, history. Let's also freeze our transformations so this object stays centered right here in the world, and it'll pop into Substance Painter centered in the world as well. So let's modify, freeze transformations. Cool. So now let's export this object. So we're gonna go File, Export Selection. And you can throw it anywhere. I usually like to throw it on my desktop for easy access. And we're gonna make sure we're exporting this as an FBX. And so if we go over here in the Options panel, there's some very specific settings we need to make sure that we do before taking it into Substance Painter, so we have all our tries accounted for and we're not messing up our geometry. So if we open geometry here, we want to make sure that we enable smoothing groups. We want to turn off triangulate all the time. And we want to, yes, okay, so then we want to turn on tangents and binormals. We can turn off reference assets content. And we can also turn off smooth mesh. It depends on how you want your geometry to come in. Depending on if it's a game engine, we can turn on triangulate. You don't have to. But in this case, I think I'll actually recommend it. So let's turn on triangulate. And then let's give it a name. So I'll just go ahead and name it oil underscore barrel. You can name it whatever you want to, as long as we can find it. Let's export. Cool. So now we can close out of Maya. Today would be nice. Amazing. All right, so now let's pull up Substance Painter. Does anyone have any questions so far?
No, we're good at the moment.
Awesome. Okay. So now that we have our object, we need to import into Substance Painter, and there are pretty specific settings on getting this object in and getting it ready. So if we just navigate up here, let's hit File and New. So right here, where it says file, let's select our object. So let's navigate to the oil barrel, open. And in this case, since we're not working with any specific cameras, we just want to paint on this object, let's just deselect import cameras. And down here under document resolution, 1024 is usually a good resolution to have your textures at. I like to up it up a little bit at 2048. Usually ends up looking better when we import these maps into Maya and when we render. And then for normal map format, we're going to use DirectX. If you know that you're definitely going to take this into Maya, the maps back into Maya, we can do OpenGL, but for right now, we'll just have it DirectX. As a lot of people just like to render their final object in Substance, so DirectX works for now. And let's hit OK. And we have our object. So real quick, I think now that we have an object in here, I'd like to go over basic navigation in Substance Painter. So the navigation is essentially our Maya controls. So just going over that, Alt left click is gonna rotate around like this. You can rotate this way. Alt middle click is gonna help you pan. So you can move this up or down, left or right. And the same thing is for Alt right click. We can zoom in and out to see our model a little bit better. If you haven't noticed already, so we have two panels. Right here, we have our object. And then right here, we have the UV maps that came in with our FBX. So a few hotkeys here. If you hit F1, we're gonna have this template. So we have our object, and then we have our UV maps. If we hit F2, we just have our object. So it gives you just a little bit more room to paint with, a little bit more leeway to work with. If you hit F3, we're directly on our UVs. So if we want to paint directly on our UVs rather than painting on our object, this is a good way to do that. I usually like to have F1 up as I can kind of see exactly where I'm painting on my object and how it translates over to my UVs. And so when we're rotating, another hotkey that I really like to use if I want to paint in an orthographic view. So Alt left click moves it around, but if you hold down Shift while you Alt left click, it'll snap. So if we're going this way, we hold down Shift, it snaps. If we want to look at the top, hold down Shift, we snap to the top view. Sometimes it's easier to paint in orthographic views so that we're not bleeding over other sides of the model. So Shift, okay. Shift click, Alt left click plus Shift will snap to certain axes. And then if you've noticed, we have light on our model already. And so if we Shift right click, hold down Shift and right click and drag, we can move our lighting around. Depending on which side of the object we're painting on, say we're over here and it's like, oh, it's a little bit dark, we can just move our lighting over and have an idea of what we're painting. Does anyone have any questions so far? Wonderful. So I also think that for people who first start, like there's a lot of buttons in Substance Painter, and I think just kind of going over the viewport and kind of breaking that down would really help. So let's just start basically at the top. So your file edit mode window, just basic settings, but there are a few that I think everyone should be aware of that are very important, especially when you start getting into the workflow. Under file, you have your basic save as, copy. Your export textures are under file, which is good to know because this is where you're going to do all of your exporting and getting all of your maps. Edit. The most important part of under edit is project configuration. So essentially here, how this works is if you want to update your model and you're like, okay, do I create a new project? Are all of my layers gonna be gone? Is all of my painting gonna be gone? Not quite. So as long as you didn't move your object in Maya. Like you didn't move it around from its origin point. You could have added things to it, you could have scaled it, you could have modified it in any way. As long as you didn't move it or change its pivot point, you can basically export a new version of the object, go to select, import your object again, and it'll re-import the same object with your layers and painting already there. So that's something I discovered very recently, having messed up multiple times, and found that this saved my life. So you can alter your UVs and still bring the object in. You can alter the object itself as long as you didn't move it, and you'll be good to go. Window, nothing really exciting here, but I think something that's really good to know is your reset UI. Because sometimes if we're moving shelves around, for example, I like to have this shelf here, as it helps me kind of make the area where I'm painting a little bit bigger. Sometimes people lose their shelves, like if you do this and it goes away, people are like, oh no, how do I get this back? So if you go back to window and you reset UI, everything goes back to normal. So we can go on our happy way after that. And then viewport, not very important. Plugins help, nothing we need to worry about for now. Right underneath that, we have settings for our brushes up here, which I will go into more detail in a little bit. But something up here that's very important and very, very useful is this button right here. And it's called symmetry. So if you don't want to paint on both sides and feel that it's not going to be the same on both sides, we can turn on symmetry. And the real magic happens at the button next to it, where we can really alter what type of symmetry that we're going for. Are we mirroring about X, Y, Z? And we also have this fun thing called radial symmetry, where if you want to paint something around an object, you can alter your angle span of how this is going to work, whether it's going to go 360, do you only want it here, do you want it this way? There's really a lot of freedom there, rather than having to repaint the same thing over and over. And this one right here just toggles a gizmo, so that you can change the spot that you want this to go over. Your symmetry point, essentially. So that's very convenient as well. And on this side, we have our 3D, 2D, 3D, 2D only. So basically what I was telling you with the F1, F2, F3, if you don't remember those hotkeys, you can also access that here. So if you just want to see your object, it would be 3D only. If you want to see your UVs, 2D only. And then 3D and 2D, you can see your object and your UVs. This one right here toggles between perspective and ortho. So basically what I was telling you, the hotkey was shift, alt left click and shift to kind of snap to different views, but you can also toggle ortho and perspective up here, and then the hotkeys for that is F5 and F6 as well. And then this one we don't use very often, so I won't really cover it, but this one is very important. So this little camera right here, which I will go into at the very end, is our render settings. And Substance Painter uses iRay rendering. So we can use HDRI for real-time rendering, and if you just kind of toggle back and forth, that's how we get into that. Any questions? Everyone's looking good? Awesome. Let's move on to the toolbar on the side. So right here, which is basically the epitome of this program, is our paint tool. So we have our paint tool right here. We can toggle between that. Painting is just, our regular paint tool. And then we have physical paint, which is big facts. Substance Painter can paint with particles too. So we can toggle through regular painting or through physical paint, which is essentially particle painting, which is very exciting. The next one here is our eraser tool. I don't really recommend using this. It's kind of tedious to go in and kind of erase things, but it can come in handy if you're just trying to clean up like little edges or anything like that. Right here, we have our projection tool. It kind of just helps if you want to paint in a certain direction. I personally don't use it very often. It's a little bit, I think it's a little bit redundant. I feel like as long as you are snapping, if you want to paint on a certain axis, like, oh, I want to paint on the top view, as long as you're snapping to the top view, you should be good to go. But this one, polygon fill, this is a very important tool. So when we're painting, we have options. We can either paint free-handed, or we can paint based on the polygons of our object. So the way this works is if you want to fill an area very quickly, we don't necessarily have to paint directly, like try to kind of paint all over the whole thing. We have options to fill based on triangles, based on polygons, based on the mesh itself, meaning I could grab one of these and have it paint on the mesh or paint on UVs, which allows me to paint on all of my UV shells. We'll get into that in a little bit, but this tool is something that you really want to keep in mind because you will use it the most often. And so let's move over here. So what I was talking about in the beginning about texture sets. So if you remember when we were in Maya, we had assigned a material to our object and named it oil barrel. So Substance has taken this texture and has identified it as, okay, so this object now has one texture set for us to paint on. And usually the advantage of having multiple texture sets is that you can toggle them on and off. So if, say, I had a complicated character where I wanted the body and the head to be different textures, I would go into Maya and assign different textures and name them, like head, body, arms. And when I export into Substance, I would have all of those texture sets here. So if I just want to work on certain parts of the body at certain times, I can toggle off all the other layers and just work on that certain part. You could, of course, just assign one texture to everything and bring it in. I just think if you have a complicated model, it makes it cleaner to have multiple texture sets. Also, another time when you would want to have multiple texture sets is if you're playing with opacity, because opacity has its own channel, which you guys can ask me about later. I can go into that. But opacity needs its own texture set because you have to change. There are some settings you have to alter for Substance to be able to pick that up and render it. So something to keep in mind also when bringing in the model is to kind of block out your materials and know, am I going to use opacity, and make sure you assign that texture set before bringing it in, or you will have problems.
Are texture sets and layers different things?
Yes,
Okay.
they are. So the texture set is essentially this one texture, was one material that this object has, whereas one texture set can consist of multiple painted layers on that object, if that makes sense.
All right.
So yeah, let's go into layers then. So the layers are basically all of the different painted layers that we're gonna have on top of this object. I'll go into the difference between fill layers and paint layers when we start painting, but essentially it works similar to Photoshop layers, as the layer on top is the one that's gonna show up the most unless you hide it. You have blend options here for different layers. You have opacity options here for different layers as well. And you can just keep building. There's no limit to how many layers you want to add. You can just keep, one texture set can take so many layers on top of each other to just create as complicated of a material as you want to. And when we export, all of those layers essentially become one material for this texture, for the material of the object. Right here we have texture set settings. So essentially every object will have channels that we can mess with. And these channels, altering these channels basically creates a material. So we have base color, we have metallic, roughness, normal, height, normal maps, height detail. So, and we can also add different channels depending on what we want. So emission is something that I use very often, and something that isn't usually a default. If you want to paint with emission, that's something you're going to have to add to your texture set. But that's part of the workflow that we're going to cover very soon, but this is where you would need to find it. And yes. Okay. Let's just move on to the shelf before we start painting. This is where all of the magic happens, where you can find all of your different options of painting and all of that. I won't go through all of these, but the most important ones are alphas. So alphas are essentially height detail, where these are kind of like stamps. So when you can stamp on these shapes and sizes, shapes and these shapes onto our object to get different different designs. We can do different sizes. We'll experiment with that in a little bit. Grunges are also very similar. Basically, they're almost like adding like a new paintbrush to your paint, adding a new almost like a filter over your paintbrush, allowing you to paint with all of these options. Same with procedurals. It's essentially like painting with a paintbrush with a filter on top. So you're gonna end up getting this design on your model when you're painting with it. And something that's very, very important, well, actually before that, like I mentioned, you can also paint with particles. You can find these here. Like I said, under the brush settings, you would want to make sure you're doing physical paint in order to paint with particles. And here are materials and smart materials. So kind of just going into this, in Substance Painter, we have a lot of pre-built materials for certain looks. For example, if you wanted to make this barrel metal, we wouldn't necessarily have to paint the whole thing metal. There's pre-built materials that we can use to kind of give it an overall look and then modify it the way we want. We could also go into these materials and change them. For example, if we had this aluminum material and we wanted it to be red, for example, there are ways, we have a lot of flexibility to alter the materials that are already there. Any questions? Anything, concerns?
Nope, making sense so far.
Awesome. Alrighty, shall we start baking the object and painting stuff?
Yeah, I want to see you paint it.
Awesome.
Yes.
Awesome. All right. So the very first step to painting is we need to bake out our maps. So baking out our maps, we need to go into our texture settings. So the reason we bake out our maps is that it's a way of telling this object that this object now has all of these channels that we can make a part of its own texture set. So let's just add an emissive. So if we go to the plus sign here, so we can also paint with emissive, because I think that's pretty fun and exciting. Let's add emissive. And then if we go into bake mesh maps. Okay. So there are also some settings to adjust here. Let me just go through this. Turn off ID. And then we also want to use low poly mesh as high poly mesh. So one thing that actually hasn't even been taught to me yet about Substance is that you can bring in a very high poly mesh and bake out its maps to go onto a low poly mesh as height detail. So rather than importing a very high poly mesh into like a game engine, for example, we can take a low poly mesh and throw on a normal map and a height map from a high poly mesh and kind of just fake it with lighting, which is really awesome. But at this point, we're using a low poly mesh, so let's just use low poly mesh as the high poly mesh. Let's also change our output size. 2048 high res is usually a good way to go. And let's bake. So now if you see here, this object has these maps baked into it, which is basically Substance's way of identifying all of these different channels. So if you toggle C on your keyboard, you can kind of go through and look. We haven't added any detail yet, so right now everything is kind of empty. And then if you want to get out of this mode, if you hit M on your keyboard, it'll go back to materials mode. Okay, is everyone good with their baked maps? Awesome. Let's start painting, shall we?
Yes.
All right. So, like I said, up here, we have, in order to paint, we need a layer, or it's not going to go into anything. But we have two different options here. So, this one right here is called a paint layer. And this one right here with a little paint bucket is called a fill layer. And they are very different, to say the least. If you notice here in the paint, when you toggle the paint layer, you have access to your paintbrush, you have access to symmetry, and you have access to all of your brush size and all of that. But when you go into fill layer, all of those things go away. Essentially, you cannot paint in a fill layer. You can only fill the layer with a color or a smart material or a material. Essentially what that means is that we can just when we drag in, the way you apply, I'll just go into this, the way you apply a material is if you just drag and drop. This is a fill layer. So if you can see, you cannot paint or apply symmetry because it applies to the whole thing. But in paint layers, this is where we can do our painting. So let's experiment with that a little bit. So if we come up here, let me go in and talk about our alphas. So just to start, like a basic workflow that we like to follow is starting with alphas. So alphas are our height detail. So anything that we want to basically make this mesh look more high poly than it is, we paint with alphas. And they're down here in our shelf. So these are like little stamps that we can add. So now that we have our brush selected, we can just pick any alpha. So let's just pick this arrow circle. If we double click on it, if you can see, our brush has now taken the form of this alpha. And there are a few hotkeys that I like to use when painting. They're a little bit confusing. I think I need to talk to Substance to fix this because sometimes it just gets on my nerves. But if you control and left mouse click and move your mouse up and down, so up and down rotates your brush like this. However, if you go left to right, it affects opacity. So this is how much influence the brush is gonna have on the model, if that makes sense. And then if you control right click and move up and down, we can change the size of our brush. Okay. So what's really cool about Substance Painter and the fact that we had to bake all these texture set settings is we go into our properties, which I conveniently ignored until now because I figured it would be better to kind of go through it. We have lots of properties that we can alter for our brush, not only our rotation, size, and opacity. So if we scroll down here, we can see that our alpha has been applied. So this is our paintbrush setting. So if I double click here, we can see that it changes to whatever alpha we're using. You can also drag and drop. It'll change which alpha you're using. Double clicking is usually easier, but whichever one works. And we scroll down a little bit more. Under material, this is where we can really get creative with things that we're doing. So what we have here are color, metal, rough, normal, height, and emission. And if you remember, these are the texture channels that we baked at the beginning. So we're basically telling Substance Painter, I want all of these options to be able to paint with on my model. So I want the option to be able to paint with color. I want the option to be able to paint something metallic, to paint roughness, which is essentially how shiny or not shiny something is. I want to be able to paint with normal maps if I need it. I want to be able to paint with height maps if I need it. And I also want to be able to paint with emission. So right now, all of these are toggled on, which means if you stamp, it's basically taking the information from all of these maps. So like I said, for alphas, you could have all of these on, but usually for Substance Painter, when we go through our painting workflow, alphas are usually height detail. So we only want to add height detail to basically fake something being high res and having more detail than than we see based on our lighting. So what we'll do is we can toggle these on and off. And if you do, you see that they go away underneath here, so you don't have an option to use it anymore. So for our alpha, let's just turn off everything except for height detail. So this is our first kind of pass of doing height detail stamping. So now, and one thing to remember about alphas is they function the best by stamping. If you drag, it's not gonna look the best. So let me just, okay. So right here, if you look down here, I had this right here, so that's why it wasn't showing up. But there's quite a threshold of how we can alter height. So if we go up, let me just toggle this all the way to 1, and we stamp, we have something that protrudes off of our model. If we go this way, it leaves an indentation. So this is a really awesome way of like just painting on like decals. We can paint on really cool like ridging detail. We could make this, if we do something like this, we can make this really customize this in different ways. And if we don't want to go all the way around, we can toggle our symmetry. Let me take off. And then we can do symmetrical stuff on both sides, just like that. If we want to have it pop out, we have something like that. Yeah, so I guess I can give you guys a few minutes to kind of add things to your barrel, and I'll check in a few minutes. And let me know if you have any questions. Also, real quick, a little tip I want to make everyone aware of. If you want to create, like, say I want to do like a straight line, and I'm like, oh no, it looks not very good. We can click and then hold down Shift, and if we click again, it'll take your alpha down in a straight line in the direction that you want it to. So just a little something when trying to create like straight lines, like some like straight indentations, can be very useful. more minutes?
Just put alphas on.
Liking your guys' stuff.
How do you color by like the vertex? Not vertex, but you're coloring specific areas.
We'll get to that.
Okay.
Yes. All right. So something that we can also do with paint layers is, of course, paint. So, and like I mentioned, we can paint with all of these channels. So usually our alphas are good for our height mapping, so let's go ahead and turn that off. And let's say we want to paint with color, maybe some metalness. We can even throw in some roughness in here. So right here under base color, we have our glorious color spectrum that we can choose from. Right here under metallic, we have a slider. If you increase this, if you can see right here, it kind of tells you how metallic how metallic your paint is gonna be, as opposed to something that's more flat. Under your roughness channel, if we bump this up, it's a little hard to see, but if we bump this all the way down, I don't know if you can see right here, we can see some glossiness. So it's telling you that it's going to be really rough as opposed to this, which is more flat. So if we want to go into painting, so let's go ahead and right now we have an alpha in our paintbrush. In order to change that, we can just go into brushes right here in the shelf. And I mean, you can pick whichever one you like. Just for basic painting, I just like to pick basic hard or basic soft, but let your creativity run wild. If you double click, it's gonna change. So right now, I have all of these turned on. So let's see, change my color to something like this. Give me 1 second. Okay, we have a glitch in the system. Give me a second. Is anyone else able to paint, or is it just me? Just me? Okay. That's odd. Oh, I see. Showing here. Okay. That's strange. But you guys are able to paint, correct?
Correct.
Okay. I will have to figure that out after this.
So is there layer 1 and layer 2?
It could be, honestly.
What if you turn off layer 2?
There we go. So, like Will so generously pointed out, the Photoshop layers, essentially I had 2 other layers on top of my layer, so it wasn't showing through. Thank you
No problem.
for letting me know. I can just throw that up here for now, so I don't get confused. So, it's a fun time. So we can paint. We want to, I have symmetry on right now. If we want to paint with emission, which is also very fun. If you go down here, you also want to make sure you change your emissive color. You can go ahead and grab the same color as this, whatever you like. Let's just kind of do the same color. So if I grab this little eyedropper, I can go and pick a color anywhere in my scene or anywhere. So let's just grab this. And now we have emissive paint going for us.
So what's the big difference between base and emissive?
So depending on the lighting, so this light is very bright right now, so the base color would kind of stay like pretty opaque. But if we drop our lighting when we're rendering, there are also post effects to really bring out the emissive color, but it would really look very glowy, like
Oh, okay.
like
Emissive is emission.
yeah, very glowy, like a light is turned on almost.
Sure.
Yeah. Let me make this a bit more presentable here. Just paint everything. I have a red barrel. And if I want this to be like a different color, something I do recommend, because we have layers for days in Substance Painter, is say I wanted to paint these arrows a different color, I would honestly add another paint layer and paint in that, because if anything goes wrong, we can just get rid of that layer. So it's highly advisable to make like very drastic changes in different layers in case you want to rearrange them, if you want to go back to them, if you want to fix them, or if you just want to delete them. Because if you paint everything in one layer and you don't like a certain part of it, you're going to be very sad, as you're going to have to like delete your whole layer, and it's not fun. So if you're making any drastic changes, you're painting something very, like, even if you're, for example, if you're doing different types of height detail on different parts, I would even do those in different layers so that we can go back and alter them, change them, get rid of them if we need to. And I also highly recommend naming your layers. So for this one, I would call it like red paint. And so if I make another layer here and I want to like color these to something. So see, this is the emissive material. It's like very neon-y.
Grab some shine.
Yeah. I want to grab something like this, and I'm like, okay, I want to paint in here. And then I find out, oh my god, I hate that so much. I can just toggle it off or delete it, whatever I need to. But at least I have drastic changes in a different layer so that I'm not sad about getting rid of my whole paint layer at a later time. Good. Do we need a few more minutes, or can we move on? Awesome.
So,
Cool. So the other type of layer that I'm sure some of us have already played with a little bit are fill layers. Okay. So with fill layers, as you can see, we cannot paint on them. There's no symmetry. A fill layer is essentially exactly what it sounds like. It's filling large areas at the same time. So if I were to go here and just add a fill layer, let's just change the color. It's gonna fill my entire mesh with this color. It's also gonna do that with my materials. So for example, all materials in Smart Materials are fill layers. So if we want this to be, let's say we want this to be like this really cool aluminum insulator material, we can just drag and drop a material right there, and it's gonna fill the whole thing. That's how fill layers work. But that's not usually how we like to texture. We like different parts of our model to have different textures and be fun and things like that. So in order to achieve that, we need to add a black mask. So essentially what we do with masking is we're taking that layer and saying, we want this fill layer to only occupy this part of the object. And now going back to when we were talking about the toolbar, this very important tool right here, which was our polygon fill, this is where that comes in handy to really help us grab chunks from our object that we want to have the specific layer on. So in order to do that, so say I just want this fill layer to be on like the top the top and the bottom of my barrel, for example. We would go to our layer. So right here, this is our aluminum insulator layer. It's still a fill layer, it's just a material. Or we could do it here too, but this is not showing currently because this is right underneath it. But we would right click and add a black mask. And everything goes away. So essentially with the black mask, we need to fill this mask with either the polygons, the UVs, or the triangles of the object in the areas that we want that material to be applied in. So for example, now with my black mask selected, I can go over here to polygon fill. And so now it gives me options. It's like, do you want to select polygons? Do you want to select a mesh? Or do you want to select UVs? So in this case, I'll just select UV chunk and click on my UV chunk. So now that chunk has taken the aluminum insulator material. And if we look over here in our black mask, we can see that this chunk is now a part of this mask, meaning this material will only be applied to this part of the object. We can click this one too, and boom. Look at that. If we want to go very specific, like faces, for example, if we selected this whole thing, that it would take up the whole thing. But say we only wanted the first row of this barrel, this first chunk right here. We could select either triangle fill or polyfill. Polyfill is usually a little bit nicer, so I prefer that one. The way you do that is just kind of drag, and it's gonna start selecting everywhere, the areas that you drag over. Say you went in a little bit too far and you're like, oh no, I don't want this part to be selected. So essentially for the black mask, right here, if we look down here at color, it's on white. So that means this is being added to the black mask. If we want it to be blacked out, I can just drop this to black and deselect it. And now we can fix our selections that we selected by accident. So it's a really versatile way of really picking and choosing places that you want to add certain textures and certain materials. So why don't you guys take a few minutes and play with that a little bit and let me know if you have any questions. How we doing?
How do I select the mesh?
What's up?
Look at black.
Okay. You want to select that? Okay, so you're gonna go over here for this one, which is polygon fill, and then here you have options. So you can either select tries, you can select polygons themselves, you can select mesh, and this one's UV,
Okay.
UV chunk. So if you select that and just click your UV, boom.
That's it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Congratulations.
How we doing? Wow.
Congratulations. Good job.
Is that one a smart material?
Some black mask, just the black mask. Just
I'm trying to learn how to use substance at all.
I failed.
Add it to my
It's
training.
so hard.
Jesus, dude. That's not what I wanted to hear.
I know.
It's not what I
I
wanted
know.
to see. The questions were
Usually,
not what I
even
wanted
for
to
like a
see.
simple object, I'll have like
Yeah.
10 layers
Energy.
in case things
really
go
ran
wrong.
out. That was the big
Yeah.
thing, was I ran out of time.
Usually
That's-
loading
that's
everything
the
into the
reason.
same layer
I'm sorry
is a
about that.
mistake.
Literally, I'm like sitting there, I'm like, this is bullshit. I kept saying it over and over and over to myself because I'm like, I'm not gonna finish this.
How you doing? Do you guys
I
have any,
made a barrel.
do you guys have any questions, concerns, comments?
You're doing very
You're doing a great job.
Wish I could. I appreciate that so much. My heart
dismissive, bro.
Your guys' barrels look cooler than mine.
Your barrel look like a shotgun shell.
How do we change this thing? Stop doing that.
What?
How do I make it just to a single icon? Not like, see, I'm just like, spread.
Well, so is that what stamp do you have right now?
Also,
Is that an alpha stamp? So alpha stamps are like meant for stamping. Just dragging doesn't really, it kind of is a,
It's like a random hand.
yeah. So if you want to rotate, if you control, left click, move, kind of control, left click, move up and down, it'll rotate. So if you hold down, control, left click. So you kind of want to do that. You can do that here too. So if you can hold down
Yeah, but
control.
once you press it once, it's still random.
So sometimes, depending on the curvature, that can happen. Also, what is this alpha? I've never seen this before. It's pretty cool though. I'm here for it. Which one? Cracks.
Why has it got an orange thing versus that thing?
So these are dynamic strokes, so they're essentially very similar to like particle effects.
Oh, so if you drag it, it's gonna go
So do you-
better than.
No, that is the part that I was doing. The physical thing. And that's what she's watching me do.
So what I didn't go over is this. There's some pretty cool stuff we can do. Why don't I show you guys the particles? How about that?
Just, just keep an eye on time because I gotta catch an eye for you. How much more?
We're almost there, I think.
Oh, for real?
I actually got through it pretty fast. I simplified my notes pretty well.
You're doing a great job.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
you're doing great.
Thank you. I think one of the last things before rendering that's really cool about Substance Painter is generators. So generator is essentially almost like an overlay to all of the painting and all of the materials and everything that we've done. So for example, if we go into our fill layer, so you can add a generator to a fill layer or a paint layer. It's kind of like, it's not a filter. So the way generators work, I can explain this. So they work based on the curvature of an object. So generators apply a certain effect depending on where there's a difference in the silhouette of the object and where there's a difference in curvature, which is why it's very important to make sure you bake your mesh maps or there's going to be no curvature for it to analyze, if that makes sense. So if we go into our layers, we can go to our mask. If we right click, add generator. Then when you go into our generator options, we have some things here. So let's just go with dirt. And so you can see that it's created this kind of dirt effect. But right here, we have options for our dirt. We can change the dirt level. How much dirt do we want? And if you can see here, I'll just point it right here. It depends on, it's really taking into consideration this curvature to kind of get the different levels of dirt right here. We can alter the contrast like that. How grungy, the scale of the grunge. How dirty do we want it? Maybe something like this. Generators are something really easy, not really easy, really fun to play with, as you can really change the look of your object with honestly just adding one filter. Yes, question.
Should the generators cover the entire object?
Mostly they do, yes.
Okay.
There's actually a complicated masking process, which I can try to explain after doing a little bit more research on that. For the most part, yes, they do cover a lot. The way I try to get around that, at least to get things moving quickly, is I try to just alter the dirt level in different ways. To fix that, for the most part, yes, they do cover the whole thing unless you mask them in a very complicated process, which if you'd like to hear more about, I can do more research and explain that for sure. But yes, they do take over the entire object. So if you're going for a grungier look, they're fantastic. They do a lot of work for you without you having to try too much. But if you want just certain parts of your mesh to be rusty or dirty, I would honestly recommend, so you can take this off. So you have your object, I would go in with a paint layer on top of this fill layer and just really kind of hone in on those spots. Because right here, with our grunges, right here in the shelf, there's lots of options that you can pick from to add to your paintbrush and just kind of paint over certain areas. So that's why paint layers and fill layers are great for filling large areas, for selecting big chunks, but for very minute details, paint layers are fantastic because you can kind of keep the detail in certain parts of the model without having to affect the whole thing. Awesome. So I think one of the last things to cover is rendering and post-process. So let's toggle over to this wonderful camera icon in the corner. And let's go to iRay. So Substance uses a renderer called iRay. And as you can see, we have a wonderful HDRI in the background. Look at that. Wow. So once you go into our iRay renderer, we have a lot of settings we can play with. So if we go over here under environment settings, we can play with our exposure, sorry, how bright or not bright we want our scene to be. Rotation, I personally would recommend staying away from this. From past experience, I have rotated the environment to a level to which I could not fix. So please be careful when rotating the environment. If we go over here to environment map, we have lots of different options of environments. We can pick this one, which is kind of just a cool little scene for our barrel to sit on. There's quite a few options here that we can pick from. And we also have an option of not having an environment at all. If we just want to put this on a background, if we scroll down here to dome and we enable clear color, we don't have an environment anymore, but we still have the lighting from that environment. So it's really great where you can kind of pick and choose your lighting, but if you hate the image and just want it to be your own image or something different, just turn that off, but we keep the lighting. And like I mentioned, if you want to change the lighting, shift, right click and drag allows you to kind of move your lighting around depending on what parts of your object you want to bring out, what parts you want to highlight, things like that. So if I really want that shine to show, I'd probably put my lighting there and really bring out that gold and some of this highlight right here. You can also alter your camera. So we have focal length, depth of field. It works really well when you have an actual HDRI background because you kind of have this cool kind of blurred background effect. With clear color, it doesn't really work because it's just a flat plane of color. So if you're going to play with your camera settings, I would recommend doing it with an HDRI. We also have post effects. So the thing about post effects is that you could do this in Photoshop, so you don't have to use Substance Painter's post effects because these are not 3D effects that if you export your maps, these effects are not going to be on your maps. These are just 2D effects that if you're going to render this image out in Substance, will be there. But if you're going to take these textures and say you want to take these textures and put it into Maya, put it into Unity, put it into Unreal, these post effects are not going to come with it. It's just a temporary, I want to make this Substance render pretty type of effects. And in order to activate them, there's lots of options. You can do color correction, tone mapping. You want to make sure you check the boxes so that it knows that you want to use these. And we can kind of play around. So this is a vignette. You can add glare. You want to be careful with this one. So this works mainly with more emissive surfaces. I would be careful with glare. It kind of just adds some like really, really, really intense shine. Play with this. Some cool things you could do. See that? We can see the glare now coming off of that point, this point of where it's like shiny. So we can make it like really shiny, like if you're doing like a diamond ring or something, having that like little like sparkle at the end of it is like a cool effect. And then here, shader settings. This is essentially altering. So if you had something emissive, you can make that emission more intense. Scattering, if you had something like skin, leaves, anything where light is doesn't pass through completely but just scatter, you can kind of alter those settings. So you're given a lot of freedom even after painting to alter those certain things. So if you feel like you painted your emission but it's not emissive enough, you can come in here and alter it before you render. And just rendering here is very, very straightforward. If you override your viewport resolution, you can essentially type in what resolution you want to render at, 4K, whatever you need. And then your samples, depending on how the quality of the image that you want. I usually like to set my samples to around 5,000 is usually a good amount. 10,000 kind of goes a little overboard. 5,000 is good. And you want to set your time to I like to set it about 10 minutes at 5,000 samples for like a really pretty crisp quality render. Any questions? Yes.
So you said you can export the texture?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Why don't I go through that real quick? So this is if you want to render in Substance, you alter your settings, you hit save render, and you're good to go. But if you wanted to take these into a game engine, if you want to take it into Maya, start rendering in Arnold, essentially you would go up here to File, and you want to export your textures. Make sure all of your maps are correct. And then I usually find that setting this to PBR... There's lots of options here. They have options for Arnold 5, they have options for Unity 5 and all of that. Unreal Engine, you could experiment with these. Personally, I just like keeping it at PBR Metal Rough. I've experimented with using that in Maya, using it in Unity. It works fine when you plug in your textures. So PBR Metal Rough is a good way to go. I would highly recommend exporting your textures that way. Any questions?
Does it export our layers?
So the layers will combine and make your texture. So essentially what your texture looks like, like this, it'll export all of the maps looking this way. So you'll see your textures will be as UVs, like this. And so when you apply them to your object, your flattened out UVs will take their shape on your object. So that's why it's very important to have good, at least decent UVs, so that it doesn't look distorted. Okay?
Cool.
Alrighty, well, I think that completes the workshop. Thank you for hearing me out.
Well done.
I appreciate your support.